Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rodney Sharman. I'm a composer and serve on the Council of the Canadian League of Composers, and I am the president of the Canadian section of the International Society for Contemporary Music. I'm speaking to you today, as is our guest, Alex Clark, from the traditional territories of the Musqueam people in Vancouver, Canada. Now, we use land acknowledgements and they've become something of a pro forma activity, but I want us all to take something of our lives to really consider this. My father spoke Cree fluently, although he was white, and I grew up thinking that I had a certain degree of sensitivity to the concerns of First Nations people, and have, particularly since 2017, been horrified and ashamed at so much knowledge that I've acquired, necessary knowledge that we all as settlers must acquire. Most recently, the fact that I live in British Columbia, which I always thought was named for the Columbia River, but indeed it's named for Christopher Columbus. The Columbia River was named for Christopher Columbus, just like the country of Columbia and the female personification of the United States of America and so many things in this hemisphere. So please take the time to get to know not only your area, but as much as you can about life as it was and life as it now is on Turtle Island. The Canadian League of Composers serves to enhance the livelihood and lives of composers as best we can. That's usually done in the form of lobbying. You probably all have used our CLC rates to find out how much a commission is worth, but we do far more than that. There's an educational component called Pivot, which happens every year, especially for young composers. There are these webinars. There is our representation at the ISCM. And in addition to this, the ISCM, that is to say the International Society for Contemporary Music, is launching a pilot project to commission a First Nations composer once every 2 years for our submissions to the World New Music Days, wherever it is happening. Now, I would encourage all of you, whether you're students or composers listening in, to join the Canadian League of Composers. There is a special student rate, and we need you as much as you, in a sense, benefit from us. We need you in order to be not only more inclusive, but more representative of composers of all ages and for the entire country. Now, our website is composition.org, and I would encourage you to go there too to have a clearer idea of who we are, who my fellow counselors are, and so on. Cet séminaire est aussi disponible en français pour toutes les questions quand il y a des gens qui veulent poser des questions en français. You can all leave questions for us in the comments section, and we will endeavor to relay them to Alex. Alex I've known actually by reputation before I knew him in person, because he was a composition student of my dear friend Linda Catlin Smith. He teaches at the VSO School in Technology. He's artistic associate of the Vancouver Symphony, whose duties in part are orchestral librarian. And this is essential knowledge, not only for any composer wishing to write for orchestra, but any composer of Western notated music who wants to give parts to their players. So I will turn this over now to Alex Clark.
Thank you, Rodney. That was a lovely introduction, and I appreciate your words very much. Thanks everybody for coming today, and those of you watching this later on the internet, if it exists in that form. I've done a presentation similar to this for groups of students or young emerging composers, not always young, but emerging composers on the orchestra scene for a thing that we do here at the Vancouver Symphony called the Jean Coulthard readings. Jean Coulthard was a composer in town, and this is a part of her legacy lives on in our annual readings that we do. And so for those, we select, usually it's 5 or 6 compositions, and we spend about 20 minutes each reading these things. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as it comes up. I'm just going to jump into the presentation here. I just need to find the place where I'm sharing my screen. I think it's here. And play. Of course, the Zoom controls are covering the play button. So hold on a second. There we go. All right. So today we'll talk about score and part preparation for orchestra. So this is, we'll talk about digital and hard copy. Mostly this presentation is about hard copy, but we will touch a little bit on the current situation about sending either PDFs or music that's for iPad or similar device for an orchestra to read. In my experience, most of the orchestras currently, this is 2021, are not using iPads exclusively. Most of them still use printed pages, so that's why we're going to focus mostly on the hard copy. I suspect that eventually we'll all get over to iPads, and when we do, this presentation will be a little bit different, but a lot of the things will remain the same. So just a little bit, how do I start this here? There we are. A little bit about me. As Rodney alluded to, I finished a composition degree at Wilfrid Laurier University with a side of viola, is what I say, because we had to study an instrument when we do a music degree, and viola was the one that I did, which actually helps with the next 2 things on this list: the librarian at the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony, and then assistant librarian at the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra. Being a string player, a lot of what the library's job is creating bowings or copying bowings, and bowings as a string player come quite naturally to me. So that helped me get that job for sure. Not all librarians are string players. Some of the best ones are not. Just like conductors can be anybody they want as well. I've also created a company called Ociosa Productions, and this is a company that I use to do concert production, any kind of copyist work, or any other sort of side things. I compose and arrange under that banner as well. All right, so enough about me. Let's talk about our agenda today. So today is score and part preparation for orchestra. So we'll look at sort of the range between orchestral composition readings, like our JCRs, Jean Coulthard readings at the VSO, to professional commissions. And I put this as a range, but really we're trying to get to about the same level of professionalism for everything that we put on the stand. So it may be a range of experience, but the music should be as professionally high quality as possible. So we'll talk a little bit about layout standards for scores, and then we'll get on to parts. I've got some examples. We'll talk about specific instruments, binding and digital distribution, as well as suggested for the reading. So I do have some examples if we have time at the end. I'm a Finale user, so I can show you some examples in Finale on how to do some of the things that I've talked about. I've also got a list of questions that were submitted in advance of this that I will make sure to get to. So, orchestra readings to professional commissions. So the journey of your music from your imagination to performance is an important thing to consider in the process. The first audience is not the ticket buyer, it's the orchestra. So the new piece that you're performing with the orchestra and the musicians on the stage, they will meet your piece not by listening to it, but by reading and playing it. The purpose of the score and set of parts is to communicate to them as fast as possible what your intentions are musically. It's worth noting that orchestras are very busy. For example, here in Vancouver, the VSO, our week right now is we've been rehearsing for a concert with Rachmaninoff and what are the other they all go in and out of my head so fast. We've got a piano soloist here this week. Last week we did 3 different concerts. We did a school presentation for students coming into our hall. A couple days later, we did a pops concert with a percussionist soloist, which was a big show. And then on the Sunday, we did a show for Halloween. It was Halloween on Sunday, so we did a special Halloween show that was very spooky. But what that means is that we had our full orchestra on stage reading from 3 different parts, or reading 3 different concerts, and only rehearsing some of those shows once. So it's time is of the essence. We never have enough, and time is expensive. So because of that, we have to pay all the musicians, of course. We also have to pay the crew. We have to pay everybody who's involved in turning the lights on to creating the music and ushering in the audience. So we're always busy. There's never enough time. So the point is, be as concise as possible in your parts so that you can reap the benefits of it being readable. Yeah, we don't want the players to decipher your notation. We want them to play the music. So this is where your music should not be complicated by notation. Your music can be complicated, but the notation, nomenclature, and musical grammar should be as straightforward as possible. This meaning, we're certainly not trying to tell anybody to not write complicated music. Some of our favorite music is quite complicated, and we love reading new music, and we love hearing new music and being a part of new music. But if there's an easy way to say it that way. Don't overcomplicate things, and take your score and part preparation as seriously as you take writing the music. I really strongly advise this, because if it's not clear that you care about your parts, then the musicians will not care as much about making it right. And I'm always impressed by how seriously the musicians take new works, and how carefully they learn their parts, how carefully the whole process is from when they receive things to when they are playing it. And so if you're coming to a reading, for instance, you've only got a 20-minute time slot. And so that means for us, we recommend 6-minute pieces or so that we can play through it once, have a little discussion, figure out if there's something we can adjust, or see if there's something that you've learned in hearing it just in the moment, and then we play it again. So if you only have 20 minutes and a 6-minute piece gets played twice, there's not a lot of room for questions from every orchestra member. So being as clear as possible is super important, and as legible as possible. So like I was saying earlier, taking it seriously is important, but you can also hire a copyist. Finding a good copyist is a really big deal. If you find somebody who's who can create all of these things, and you can afford to pay them, then that's a great option. If there's anything I've learned in this past year of pandemic that we've gone through, or year and a half, or however long it's been now, it's that there are a lot of people who are good at a lot of things, but being good at everything is not a great option. So if you have the money, hire a copyist, or get really good at copying your own music. So commissioning agreements, I should mention, can include copyist fees. You can negotiate that when you are working on your commissioning agreement. So a lot of the times this is just another budget item in the grant that you or the orchestra or whoever is applying for. So this is sort of moving past the orchestra reading and into the professional commissioning area. So find a copyist, ask how much it'll cost to do the work, do it properly, give them an idea of what the work is, and find out how much that's going to be, and add that to the list of things that you'd like from the orchestra. You have a fee that you can find out how much you can charge on composition.org. I know I've frequented that website myself, but you can also find copyist fees for things, and you can add those things to your commissioning agreement, which is a great idea. Orchestras are probably going to go for that, and most of the time they don't know about it, or you don't know about it, and then it's just something that gets missed. And so yeah, just might as well ask. Maybe they won't have the money for it, but if they do, might as well ask. It's just something else to go into the budget. All right, so I'd like to start here by talking about standard layout. So I used to tell people that 11 by 17 tabloid size was the standard for scores. I'm taking that back. I think we should avoid 11 by 17 if possible. This is the big. It's like this big, super tall. It doesn't fit on the stand very well. Even an oversized conductor stand, this big pile of 11 by 17 scores, if it can be avoided, it should. Now the exception could be for a reading that has to be really quick. You've only got a few minutes, and you need to have everything super clear, and you don't have a lot of time to produce the score. You can get away with 11 by 17. We'll take an 11 by 17 score, but I'll be a lot more impressed if the score comes in and it's the same size of the parts, maybe just a little bit bigger. So we'll talk about that. Shared staves and brackets. We'll just breeze through some of that as well. And my next slide should have those things on it. So here we go, brackets. This is just the flute section, but this is the same for all of the sections in the orchestra, which we'll talk about in a moment. You can see some of the examples here. Yes, okay, not this, yes, and okay. So I really like the fourth option over. That's my favorite. With this bracket, we can see on the fourth one, it's 2 lines. It says yes above it. We can see that the flute 1 and flute 2 are on one line, and the piccolo's on the other line, the next line, I should say. And there's a bracket indicating that that's one section. So that's my favorite. Let's look at the first one. So this is sort of a spot the differences challenge, but we've got flute 1 and 2 on their own line. Now, this is a good idea if the flute 1 and 2 have very different parts. If they're not super different, it's a lot better to have them on the same line. And I'll demonstrate that a little bit later near the end of this. And then the piccolo's next below that. So its score order, actually, even though the piccolo is higher, the piccolo is third player in most orchestras in a standard instrumentation. So you wouldn't necessarily, if you only have one piccolo, which is fairly standard, that would be the flute 3 and the piccolo player. So any of these auxiliary instruments, which I'll show you a giant list in a moment, are usually the third player. The first player is the principal player. That part usually has solos. That part usually has the higher notes. Second player is the assistant principal or associate principal. These are just titles, and they're more of a supporting role, not the human, but the part is more of a supporting role. But there are lots of great examples of flute 2 solos as well. So you don't have to just give your solos to the flute 1, but if you give all the solos to the flute 2 and nothing to the flute 1, there's going to be some eyebrows raised. So just a heads up about that one. So that's shared staves and brackets. This is an important thing for the score. When we talk about the shared staves and brackets, we shouldn't have parts that are shared. And I'll maybe talk about that when we get to the parts section of this presentation. But the flute part shouldn't have a flute score. Flute 1 shouldn't have flute 2 and 3 on lines below it. Everyone just gets their own part. If there's something really important they need to see, give it to them in a queue. That's fine. But we don't want any kind of scoring happening, with the possible exception of percussion, which we'll talk about that too. So that's shared staves and brackets in the score. Let's look at score order and instrumentation list a little bit further. So this example, this is from Mahler's first symphony, Titan Symphony. So this gigantic instrumentation, these numbers and letters and everything at the top is just shorthand for the library, or shorthand for anyone looking to program this work. It tells me that there are 4, 4, 4, 4, 3 in the woodwind section, meaning 4 people playing flute or auxiliary, 4 people playing oboe or auxiliary, 4 people playing clarinet, 3 people playing bassoon. So it's important to know your doubling instruments, and looking at this on the far left at the big long number list, where we see 4 and then bracket 1.2/pick2.3/pick1.4/pick3. What that's telling me is that there are those 4 players are separated by the dot, the period. So there's the first player is only going to play flute in the entire piece. The second player is going to play flute as well as piccolo, and they'll be playing the second piccolo part, because the third flute is the one who's the standard piccolo part. So third player is playing piccolo 1, and then the fourth player is playing fourth flute and piccolo 3. So this is a lot of information, but it's Mahler, and he liked to write big. The same is true. Next, we've got the oboes. So we've got 1, 2, and then the third oboe / English horn. Third oboe is playing the English horn because the third player is that auxiliary player. And then the fourth player is a fourth oboe, alone oboe. Next, we've got 1, 2, 3 / BCL / E flat clarinet 2. A lot of information there. That third player is getting a tripling on this concert because they're playing clarinet, bass clarinet, and E flat clarinet. So E flat clarinet is the piccolo clarinet cousin of the B flat or A clarinet. Most orchestras, the B flat and the A clarinet is not a doubling. It's just it's a lot of the time it's easier to play fingerings on an A clarinet than a B flat clarinet. So that's what we're looking at there. And then the fourth is playing clarinet as well as E flat clarinet 1. So yeah, it's a lot of information there. If you're doing a commission, make sure you are communicating with the people who are commissioning you and asking about what are the doublings that I'm allowed to do. Every orchestra is going to have a different sort of rule set for doubling. At the Vancouver Symphony, we have an agreement with our players that there's a certain number of them who just do doubling, and their pay is prorated for that. In some orchestras, anytime a clarinet player plays a bass clarinet or an E flat clarinet, they get a step up, and so that means it costs the orchestra more money. It's great for the player; they get to play more things. If there's no rules, you can give everybody a doubling, and then everyone gets paid more, and they like you a lot. But your piece might not get played elsewhere because it will become expensive, paying for all those doublings. And usually, doubling it could be anywhere from, it might just be 20% step up for their fee, or it might be 50%, or who knows? It's different at every orchestra. So make sure you're communicating with the orchestra to find out what the doubling situation is, and if you're allowed to do it. Also, it's worth knowing that most orchestras in Canada don't have more than 3 winds in each section, so more than triple winds, as in more than 3 flutes, 3 oboes, 3 clarinets, 3 bassoons. Smaller orchestras likely will have 2, and so bringing in a third player or a fourth player will require bringing in an extra musician and paying that extra musician besides what everyone already is being paid. So this Mahler is very expensive for an orchestra to play, especially because there's probably going to be a lot of strings that are going to be needed for this one. Yeah, that's the doubling and the wind numbers. When you have a commission, you'll agree to a set of numbers that looks sort of like this, or hopefully smaller, for your sake and for everyone else's sake, unless you like to write for a giant Mahler-sized orchestra. And then we've got the brass section coming up next. So this tells me that there are 7 French horns, 4 trumpets, 3 trombones, and 1 tuba. So the 7 French horns, they're just going to play French horn. That's it. If you're writing for Wagner tuba, French horns will play that as well. But that's a really big question because a lot of orchestras don't have Wagner tubas at all. And so you just maybe avoid that one unless you absolutely need to. So stick with the standard instruments if you can, and then when can't, make sure you're asking that you can do these things. And then, yeah, 3 trombones. This will be a tenor trombone, a second tenor trombone, and a bass trombone. The trumpets can double on cornet or C trumpet instead of B flat. The trombones can double on alto trombone or more bass trombones, but those are specialty instruments, so you want to make sure you're careful about that. In Mahler 1, there's 2 timpani, and then there's several percussionists as well. So this tells us there's timpani, percussion, and harp. There's no keyboard in this one. And then we get onto the strings. Strings are 2 sections of violin, 2 sections of violin, viola, cello, and bass. And those instruments don't typically double. All right, so this is the instrumentation simplified. So just taking out all those brackets, winds, brass, percussion, timpani percussion, I should say, harp, and then strings. So looking at the score, we could have had 41 staves of music, just counting up all of those instruments. So if we go back a few slides just to look at this, flute 1 and flute 2 and piccolo, oops, went back 2, there we go. We could, if we give every instrument in that Mahler list, that first flute section would have 4 staves. Let's just see what the publishers did here. So they've put the piccolo, 2 piccolos on one line and said they're also flute 3 and 4. Typically, I'd like to see the piccolos below the flutes, but this is okay. As long as it stays consistent throughout the score, that's okay. Then we've got flutes 1 and 2 on the next line, oboes 1, 2, and 3 on the third line, oboe 4 on its own. Probably later on it has either not much to play or something quite different to play. We've got 3 clarinets in C on that next line, as well as the 4th clarinet in E flat on the line below that. So this is the same sort of thing. We put the piccolo below the flute. We're going to do the same with the clarinet. And then we've got the bassoons, the horns, the trumpets, the trombones, the no tuba. We have 2 of those timpani, and then percussion, and then strings. So you can see sort of how they combine things to make the score a little bit more legible. We could have had a score that had 41 staves that had everyone playing, and all you see is this wall of little notes going across the page, which I hope you'll agree this is much more succinct. So at the end of this, we'll talk about how to do that, at least in finale. I know you can do it in the other major ones as well, being Sibelius, Dorico. Heard really good things about Dorico. I'm thinking about getting into it. Maybe somebody can convince me later. All right, standard layout for score, further notes. I think did I make a further notes slide? I did, good. So it's a good idea to have the copyright symbol down at the bottom, put the year, so that you get to hold on to that. You can say, what is the specific thing I have here? Copyright, all rights reserved at the end, and then you're just kind of telling everybody that they're not allowed to play this music without contacting you or getting permission or renting it. You should make it a transposing score. Don't submit a C score to an orchestra. Nobody wants to read C scores. It's easier sometimes, especially if you're a string player and you have no idea how transposing instruments work, to sometimes write in a C score, but don't hand in a C score. It would be better to get used to writing in a transposing score and just learn how to do that, because you should know those things anyway. You've got an instrument list. This is a good idea to have an instrument list on the page prior to the very first page of the score. So this is the list that says, here are all the instruments. So it'll just be a list, flute 1, flute 2, flute 3 doubling piccolo. Make each one gets their own line. Don't write through 3 flutes doubling piccolo, because that's kind of ambiguous. Does that mean all 3 flutes are doubling piccolo? Or does it mean the 3rd flute is doubling piccolo as is standard? Don't be ambiguous. Just, you've got space on an empty page, just put it in there. Rehearsal figures and bar numbers. Bar numbers should be not on every bar. You don't need it on every bar. If you're in a recording session with an orchestra, having bar numbers on every bar is a good idea, just in the score, just at the bottom, because it'll be just a lot quicker to say we need to punch in measure 25 and 26 just to fix a couple of notes, and then you can find it very quickly. But for rehearsing and well, you don't need them for concerts, but for rehearsing, it's really important to have rehearsal figures so that you can say, all right, everybody, let's go from rehearsal G or rehearsal 17. Rehearsal figures can also just be big bold bar numbers as well. That's totally fine. But these rehearsal figures should be at sort of standard starting points that the conductor might want to begin rehearsing something. Sometimes they'll be just after a pickup, so they'll say, let's go from the pickup to B, and then everyone knows where they're playing from. It's better to have too many of these, excuse me, too many of these than not enough of these. You don't want to have to say, can we go from 17 bars before B, and that being the best direction, because that can be too far. Try to avoid collisions. So collisions are those things where you've got a pianissimo here and a crescendo here, and they're kind of touching each other. I see that more than I would like in things that come across my desk. So this is an easy thing to proofread because they're very noticeable. And so sometimes it's not until you've printed something that you start to see it. A good process, if you can, for proofreading is to actually print the score on regular paper and then just read through it and circle things with a red pen or pencil or something and say, these are the things I've got to fix. Sometimes seeing it on paper actually helps you realize what you're doing wrong. So that's a good idea. Additive rhythms for uncommon times. I put a little joke to myself that I think that's a good title for a piece. Additive rhythms are this is like a 5/8 bar or a 5/4 bar or a 7/4 bar or any number of odd numbers. These are always groupings of twos and threes. You'll never, in a 5/4 bar, you should never have a whole note because you don't have a grouping of 4 and 1 to make a 5/4 bar. You can metrically make it sound like that, but you want to have the notation be 3 + 2. So you might have a dotted half note tied to a quarter note, and then a quarter note staccato or something. So that's still 4 beats and then 1. And it'll sound like that to the audience, but you kind of have to think about additive rhythms and uncommon times as how is the conductor going to show this. So in 5/4, they make a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or they make a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so you want to make sure that you're spelling that out as easily as possible, especially for reading, because they might not have had a chance to really dig into learning your piece in time. So being as clear as possible so the conductor has to make as few notes as possible on his or her score is really important. Bottom line, just be clear. As clear as possible in every way you can will save time. Saving time is what gets rehired when the musicians say, that was such a great piece to play, that was really nice. Then the administration and the artistic team hear that and say, okay, good, we should do that again. The audience response will help too. But if the piece is easy and on time and everything else, the orchestra will leave with a good taste in their mouth, and that's a very good thing. All right, let's talk about standard layout for parts. So along with between parts and scores, most of this presentation is just go and look at the thing, go and look at someone who's done this already, and just try to be like them. Like that Mahler that we looked at. You can find out. I just downloaded that from IMSLP. IMSLP.org, I believe, is a great resource for music that's been released into the public domain by a composer dying more than 50 years ago. And a lot of that stuff is still quite relevant today, even if our musical tastes are changing. I mean, we're playing Rachmaninoff this week, and his music is on IMSLP, so we can go and study those scores whenever we want for free. Anyone in Canada can, anyone around the world can. So it's a great resource. Download Mahler and have a look at what 41 different parts looks like condensed into a score, and use that as an example. And the same for the parts. You can get the parts on IMSLP as well. You don't have to buy them from a publishing company, but that's an option as well. Yeah, we want to look at what contents are necessary in a part. We're going to look at page layout in a moment. A huge thing to consider is page turns, especially for printed parts, and other pagination concerns or considerations. Bar numbers, as I said, should be at the beginning of each line in a part. Maybe I didn't say that yet. They should be at the beginning of each line in the part and the score, but it's important that you have it at the beginning. You don't need to have bar numbers across multi-measure rests, but we're going to talk about multi-measure rests and cues as well. And we're going to talk about file names. This is something that people sometimes don't think about, but it would be great if they did, because it just makes organization so much easier. So let's move on. Let's look at this part. This is, again, Mahler Symphony 1. We're looking at the first movement this time. And this is a scan of the first page of the part for violin 1. So there's lots of stuff to look at on here. Everything is laid out quite nicely. There's not a lot of room for bowings. You'll notice the pencil markings here. I wouldn't mind a little bit more room in some places for writing bowings. You can see on the second to last line, there's an up bow that is kind of having a collision with a note to where to start pianissimo. So we want to make sure, oh yeah, again, on the third line, right at 3, you can see they want to play that down, but there's not a lot of room, so they're kind of writing over things. So consider that the people are going to mark bowings into your part. It's always my recommendation that you don't mark bowings unless it's for a specific reason. Stravinsky, down, 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 down. That's something that's a specific reason. But just you deciding when they should do the down bows and up bows is not usually going to be, you're not going to get thanked for that usually. The orchestra wants to do it their own way. When we play Tchaikovsky or any other music from hundreds of years ago, we send it around to our principal string players and they bow it, and they check it and they change things every single time. There's almost never that they say, yeah, these bowings are perfect, we'll use this. And so that's what I was mentioning earlier as my job as a librarian is making sure that we are matching all the bowings to every stand. Yeah, don't put the bowings in because they're going to change them anyway. Just leave them blank, unless there's a very specific purpose for it. They're, depending on the orchestra, they're going to change them from one day to the next, or one performance to the next. You'll notice there's 2 black lines on the left side. I just added those. Those would be the staples. So if you, just because I don't have a part, you're not in the room to feel the part and look at it. Those are the staples. That's where they would go on this first page. This second page, they'd go in the middle. So second and third page, we can see that we have these 2 pages together. So we've gone from here, we've opened the pages to here. We're looking at, we can look at a few things here. It's currently covered by a bunch of names on the bottom side of my screen here, but you can see that that there's time to turn the page. This is a really important thing. On that page 3, you can see there's time for them to turn the page to get to page 4. Page 4 can start right away, but page 3 has a moment there where you can turn the page. We should also notice that the page numbers are in the top left and top right corners. These are the outside pages, the outsides of the page. If page numbers come in and they're on the inside where the staples are, that's a sign to me that the printing was wrong and that the pages are backwards. So it's important to keep those your page numbers, even pages on the left. Make sure I say this right. Odd pages on the right, and that way you've got a visual reminder when you're working on pagination which one needs the page turn. Page 2, if it were the second or the third page, also has a good page turn opportunity. There's 4 bars rest there, but there's not a page turn there, so we don't need to worry about that. It's better to just have 5 staves or 5 lines on the page if the 5th one has page turn opportunity, and don't separate them across the full page. Just leave the blank space at the bottom. The players will understand that it's not over yet. We just need to turn the page. There's not a double bar line at the end. So this is page turns are super important. Let's see if I've got any other notes on these. Okay, well, we also have the divises to look at, figure out how to do divises. We'll talk a little bit about that in a demonstration in a couple of minutes here. So yeah, this is the end of movement 1. I just went back a page. The end of movement 1 ends on a page turn. So this is something to consider if you have a multi-movement work. Is your attacca going to be really subtle? Is the next movement going to start really quietly and the last movement started or ended really quietly, and then you're going to have this loud page turn sound across the whole orchestra? If that's going to be a problem, make sure you start your next movement on a line that doesn't have a page turn. In this one, I think they've considered that this one can just end, and then they can turn the page as they take a breath. We're going to talk a little bit about cues as well. So usually cues are, I'm going back again, usually cues are something that happen that you want to add to a part after the player has been resting for a long time. It's kind of hard to find an example of that in a violin part, but there is one here. So if you look on the left page, page 2, they have a 16 measure rest on either side of that. There's a couple of measures. There's a couple of 4 bar rests on the left of it and a couple of extra bars after that. So that's especially for a string player, a long time to have a rest. Winds brass percussion can rest for 150 measures sometimes, and hopefully you give them cues so that they know when to come in and what to listen for, because I don't know if you've ever counted to 442 times. It's not a great time. But yeah, so looking at just before 15 on this part, we see a flute has a couple of notes. So the violins can kind of doze off for 16 bars before that, and then they hear the flute come in and they go, oh, here we go. So cues are really important for that reason. But if you look at going forward again to the second movement, hearing the I guess that's bass. The bass notes, especially those staccato quarter notes, gives you an idea of the timing. If the conductor's not clear, maybe the conductor's in 3, maybe the conductor's in 1, then at least the violins will be able to judge how they have to play based on what they're hearing. And so giving them cues at the beginning can be a nice thing, especially if it's a very exposed passage. So cue notes are a nice thing to do. Consider doing that for your players, especially if they have rests. Next, we've got file names. So here's my recommendation. You want to keep, just like you have score order on the score, you want to keep your parts in score order as well. So when you're sending your parts, if you're sending them digitally, which if you're sending them in hard copy, you should print and create parts and then send them digitally also, even unprompted, that's okay. So send your parts in hard copy, but then also say, in case you need to print anything, here are the other parts. Orchestra librarians can be trusted. You can send them to us and we aren't going to sell them. We're not interested in that. So you put the composer name, that's your name, and then the work title. It doesn't have to be lowercase, I just wrote it that way. However the work title is, followed by numbers and then a dash and then the part or score name. I put PDF at the end because we prefer to receive PDFs of music. Any librarian in the world can print a PDF. Not any librarian can print an XML file or a MUS file or something like that. A lot of them will be able to, but anyone can print a PDF. So send it this way. Then we know that your parts, that we have all of your parts. When we see bass at the bottom and it's got a number and we know that we have all of them, we'll know that we're not missing flute 4 or something if we see these numbers in here. And we'll be comparing, the library will be comparing the score and the parts as well, just to make sure, but it'll save us a lot of time and energy if you do this. So this is a request from a librarian now, is to put your things together, your file names together like this. You can do short forms, as I note at the bottom. This is how, when I save parts in the library, I will save them this way. So especially when we're doing bowings, we scan and save all the music that we've bowed. It'll be, Wagner, Rheingold, 0-1, violin 1. I'm only doing bowing, so I only need to worry about the string parts, and that's why I label it 1 rather than counting them down and labeling it 23 or whatever number it's going to be. So yeah, if you're sending all your parts together and your score can be 0, and then your parts can start at 1. It's a good idea to include the extra 0 in those single-digit numbers, because this is going to sound strange, but some computers or programs will sort things alphabetically by number, and so what that means is that you'll get 0 score, and then you'll get 1 flute, and then you'll get 10 bassoon 2, and then you'll get 11 horn 4, whatever it is, and then after all that you'll get 2 flute 2. So it goes in, they don't always sort these things perfectly numerically. So the extra 0, just make sure that it's 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, all the way to 10, 20, 30, however many parts there are. So yeah, that's not the most important thing, but something to consider. For specific instruments, orchestration and standard doubling, these are things you should know. Just know your clefs, know which ones use which. The viola, my favorite instrument, plays in the alto clef, but it also can play in the treble clef. There's lots of guides out there to teach you how to write these things. This is not an orchestration class. We're not going to go over this too much, but knowing your woodwind doublings, your brass doublings, and knowing that timpani is not part of the percussion section. Timpani is its own thing. You should not write a part that is timpani and snare drum and all these other instruments, unless you have a very explicit agreement with the orchestra that their timpani player will play all those things. Most timpani players are trained in percussion instruments as well, but they are specialized on timpani, and so timpani is its own animal. You don't mix and match those two things. Strings and divisis, you can do divisis as much as you want. We got some parts a couple years ago that had violin 1A, and then another part that was violin 1B, and then another part that was violin 1C. This is an example of where having those parts on one page would be helpful, so that the violin 1As know what the violin 1-2s are doing, and they don't have to, if the way the divisi works is left and right of the stand, inside and outside of the stand, that you can read it from one part and they're playing two different parts on the note. Just remember that strings play from 2 to a stand. Last year with COVID, it was a little different, but in all other times, strings play 2 to a stand. So keep in mind for divisis that you don't want to have the stage managers have to bring an extra set of stands out for the divisis. And sometimes you can have violin 1A at the front, violin 1B at the back, but that leads to questions about, well, does that mean that violin 1B, the third desk back, is the new violin 1B principal player, and do they get a step up for that? So these are kind of questions that you can ask any librarian. How do you want to deal with this? How should I do these divisis? That's important, and knowing score order is really important too. Most of these notation softwares will just know what score order is and just do it, but you can fix it if you see something wrong. So knowing what score order is really important. Let's see, binding and digital distribution. So I am going to make sure that these slides are available for everybody afterwards, but because there are some links coming up for some really great videos on how to bind parts. But the most important thing is to coordinate with your orchestra library. Printed parts and scores, don't go smaller than 9 by 12. These measurements are in inches. Don't go smaller than 9 by 12 because 8.5 by 11 is too small and it looks very unprofessional. the stand. When the musicians get that, they're going to be squinting at it, and they're not gonna love it. Our standard at the VSO, and it's different everywhere, but our standard is 10 by 13. That way, when we receive a 9 by 12, it's actually a little bit bigger. So send 9 by 12 and we'll print it on 10 by 13 is sort of the thing. Then the musicians can't complain that it's too small. Somebody had a question about what paper do we use. Well, I would suggest using good paper. We use cream paper and 70 pounds, so it's a little bit thicker. Ours is from Spring Hill, but it could be from anywhere. 70-pound cream paper is a great way to start. And then for digital distribution, don't go smaller than, don't go larger than 9 by 12, because the iPad size is actually about the size of, the iPad Pro is about the size of an 8.5 by 11. So it actually makes it shrink down a little bit. You can go into the iPad and expand the size of it yourself when you're a performer, but this is why I just recommend 9 by 12 as the default option for everything. If your score must be bigger, 10 by 13 is fine. Well, that's okay too. If you can avoid 11 by 17 for scores, do that. If you really can't, okay. But I would argue that you probably could find a way. Never print 11 by 17 for a part. Nobody's stand. It'll just flop over the stand, and it'll get all wrinkled at the top when they try to store it. Everything will get folded in like that, and it won't look very nice. So that's that. Here are the things that I want to share. So an excellent example of tape binding is this YouTube video, which I'm not going to play right now, but you can follow up with that one later. It was I think one of the first ones when I searched in Google like tape binding musical parts, and this was my favorite one. This one's amazing. It's tape binding is great because it doesn't when you have coil bindings on everything, the coil takes up all this space on this side, and then the parts kind of go in on this side, and it just doesn't fit in any of the folders very well. And if you had 15 parts that were all coil bound, that would be terrible. They would not fit in any folders or storage devices. David Bruce's History of the Entire Orchestra, I guess, is a really good video to watch, just to kind of get an idea of where the orchestra came from and what the current role of the composer is in an orchestra setting. David Bruce is a composer in England. There's a few books to read if you're still reading books, everyone out there. These are notes from Alistair McKean. Alistair McKean's the orchestra librarian at the Sydney Symphony Orchestra in Down Under. So he's recommended these ones along with some reasons why. I haven't read all of these. I'm quite familiar with the Berlioz treatise on instrumentation, but the other ones I'm not. So I would definitely defer to Alistair for these. He's known far and wide for his library prowess. Yeah, these are some good resources. Some even further suggestions and resources. Just to reiterate, talk to orchestra musicians and librarians and ask them what you need to do, what you need to prepare for. Asking them is a really good idea, a good way to do this. Talk to other composers about their commissions. It's just great to learn about how other people do it. Find out if they hired a copyist. Find out who that copyist is. Find out how much it costs. Find out if they got the orchestra to pay for it. MOLA is an organization. This is the Major Orchestra Librarians Association. So this is a group that I'm a part of, and we meet up every year to have a conference and chat about our orchestras and pencils and all that kind of stuff. But there's also a website, and they've got a ton of resources. Most of the stuff that you'll find that I've talked about, you'll find examples of on the website. There's also great YouTube resources. My favorite right now is Finale Super User. It's this guy who's just brilliant with Finale, and he's made all these great videos and about very, very specific things. He's only got a couple thousand subscribers. Most of his videos only have a few hundred views, but they're so good because they're very specific, very niche. And yeah, also see if your local symphony library needs some help with bowings, because you can learn a lot from doing that. And lastly, and most importantly, respect deadlines and be on time, please, because that's the worst thing that can happen in the orchestra library is parts being late. We've got this mantra about living composers that, you know, being one on one side, being an orchestra librarian on the other, is I understand this, the problems of parts coming in late. So yeah, that's a very important part. Respect your deadlines. So yeah, I'm just here thanking Alistair for providing some of these documents, and for Mola as well. Yeah, we've got 5 minutes. I can jump into a finale demonstration, or I can answer some of these questions that we've got. Rodney, I see your head's popped up. What do you recommend?
I have appeared so that you will answer questions in order, because they're happening in 2 different places at the same time. The first question has to do with, does a composer have to specify which individual percussion instruments will be used before the piece is finished?
No, let me just close this. Sorry, I'm trying to get this out of the way. We're back on regular screen here. No, they don't have to, as long as they're not anything completely out of the ordinary. If you need to have water drums that Tan Dun uses, don't surprise an orchestra with that. But if the agreement is 1 mallet percussion and 1 auxiliary percussion, then feel free to throw in any kinds of snare drums, bass drums, toys that you think an orchestra will have. But it's a good idea to ask about that too. Rodney, I think you're muted. Are you reading another question?
Sorry, I was trying to. All right. Always something to learn. All right. The second question was, why is the piccolo notated below the flute, and why, say, the E flat clarinet below the B flat clarinet?
So I think the reason for this is because the standard would be to not have those auxiliary instruments. So the first standard is that we have flutes. The old orchestra, which you'll learn from David Bruce's video, the old orchestra had flutes, they had oboes, they had bassoons. We added clarinets a little later, but basically that was the wind section, was a flute or 2, an oboe or 2, and a bassoon or 2, and then they started adding the auxiliaries after. So those bones remained, and I think when you add an auxiliary, even though it's higher pitched like the piccolo, it's still an auxiliary, and it's the third player. Like I mentioned, the third player is playing the piccolo, or if there's only 2, the second player is playing the piccolo. So it's a score order thing, but it also tells the conductor who the principal player is. The principal player in the flute section is flute 1. The principal player in the clarinet section is clarinet 1, even though the bass clarinet might be playing bass clarinet and E flat and B flat, and I'll get all these doublings and tripling fees. But I think that's probably why.
Thank you. The next question is, so does the VSO get 20 by 13 paper for 10 by 13 booklets? And where do you purchase this paper?
Yes, good question. So I have a list of the paper that we get. We get Spring Hill paper, and I'm trying to remember the name of the company that we get it from. It doesn't matter. You can get it from any company that sells paper. But we get 9 by 12, 10 by 13, 11 by 17, and 13 by 19. 13 by 19 is the biggest thing that our printer can do, and fold in half, and that makes 9.5 by 13 booklets. So we can make and print those stapled booklets, or we can print them on 10 by 13 and then we tape bind them. I'm sorry, I can't give you an exact location of where we get our paper, but that 70-pound cream paper from Spring Hill is what we use.
The follow-up question is that paper mill in Wisconsin?
I don't think so. I think it's in BC. I should mention that some of these strange sizes, 9 by 12, 10 by 13, we have to get them cut that size. So we order them in bulk. And sometimes you can find an orchestra that's ordering in bulk, and you can just tack on with an order of your own. Or you can, what I always recommend at the JCR, the reading, is go to the Canadian Music Centre, because they will do all this, and they know the standards. Canadian Music Centre, CMC. At least ours in Vancouver is fantastic. I know there's 3 other ones across the country. And you can send them PDFs and they can print, and they know what they're doing. So this is not a standard print shop, and they don't charge exorbitant fees, but they print on really nice paper, and we have a good relationship with them.
Absolutely. I would reiterate that and its importance. Go to the Canadian Music Centre, and certainly the one in Vancouver. They're fantastic, and they have papers in many different sizes, and their librarian who prepares these is also an experienced composer, and so things are done right. Now, are there any more?
Rodney, I've got a couple of questions that were submitted here. Maybe I've already answered some of them, but one of them is an orchestral percussion parts organized on the score by player, or is it left to the percussionist to decide who will play which parts? Is there a standardized score order for percussion instruments? The short answer to that is no. There's not a standardization in percussion for orchestra, sadly. But part of that is because percussion has, especially in the 20th century and 21st century, has exploded into the orchestra in a way that it hadn't before. And so there's always new percussion instruments. There's always new things that they're doing. There's always more expectations of percussionists. So it's not something that you'll find in the 19th century standard. So because of that, the longer answer is probably the best practice is to have the mallets first, followed by non-pitch percussion. And then there are standards on how to notate percussion, but I've seen it in lots of different layouts. So learn your standard on how to notate a snare drum versus a bass drum or something. But yeah, you can put those under the mallet percussion instruments. And normally you're not mixing mallet percussion with non-pitch percussion, although it does happen from time to time, and with more regularity than it maybe should. And remember, timpani is not part of that section. Neither is celeste. There's a couple of examples where somebody wants to play a celeste note, but that's a keyboard instrument and it's played by the keyboard player. And the best plan would be to talk to a percussionist, especially if you talk to a percussionist who's leading the section of which your work will be played. Sometimes a percussion score is preferred, but it's very context dependent. So Rachmaninoff symphonic dances, the percussion part is a percussion score. And that way they can kind of see what everyone else is playing, and then you don't have to add cue notes, and it's all this stuff is just involved in this score. But sometimes a score can be way too much information for an individual player, and then it's not useful. So common sense can be applied to this, but talking to a percussionist can enlighten you a little bit there.
And in terms of common sense, really, with non-pitch percussion, start with triangles and the highest pitched instruments and make your way down to bass drum. That's standard as far as I've ever seen in scores.
That makes sense to me. Do you have any other questions? I see that the chat is going a little bit. Should I jump into there?
Did you have other questions that had been sent to you privately?
Well, I have one about how do you set up finale to be in line with these guidelines? Would you recommend creating a set of extra parts with letter size score or 9 by 12 and 10 by 13? Size of paper to work on questions. Should we prepare alternative sizes for the score, even if it means a lot of manual layout adjustments? So my answer for this is I would try to avoid multiple sets. Try to have one set. Find the size that works for everything. Cheat sheet is 9 by 12 works for everything because it works on the larger size paper. We can just print it at 108% or something. And it works on the iPad, which is a little bit smaller, which is great too. Score can be larger if it needs to be, but as I showed you in Mahler, it can be pretty shrunken down too. And this is great for storage when we're storing your piece in a folder afterwards, or for when you're storing it in your closet somewhere. Finale, Sibelius, Storico all have very good settings for setting up presets and templates. I don't think we're going to have time to jump into Finale today, but there's some. Once you've built your template, you can save that template and then start over from that spot in the next piece. And this is a good idea. It would be great if a group of us started sharing our templates for different things, and I think that would be a nice thing to do. I'm not gonna start anything about that today.
All right. I was going to say that we have no more questions, but we've just received another one. Can you give your thoughts on placement for a non-solo, non-standard group of instruments in a score, such as a rock band?
Oh yeah, so above the strings is the best option. So a rock band would be the same as having a piano solo. Just put them above the strings usually. I think that's the best option. If you've got a non-standard instrument like say the orchestra's agreed for you to have a saxophone, that could go in the woodwind section. You could put that after the bassoon. But the non-standard instruments, if there seems to be a place for it to fit in the score, and they're not solo instruments, I would consider a rock band as a solo group. Then you can find a way to put them into the score. I think that answers that.
And this is also true of vocal soloists and of choirs who are not soloists. They are placed above the strings.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. Just there's a question there about 11 by 17 not being the standard. So in the past, I've said 11 by 17 is the standard. I'm taking that back now. I feel that 11 by 17 is too big to store. It flops over the stand. They're just too big. If you can make it the same size as your parts or a little bit bigger, then that's a good idea. So 10 by 13 score, or for me, I usually do 9.5 by 13, so I can print it on that large paper and have it stapled if it's a small enough score. That's the best option. If you were to go and buy a Boosey and Hawkes, or I should say a Bärenreiter, Breitkopf, Beethoven part or score, the score will fit nicely on a slightly smaller than 10 by 13. So if they can do it, you can do it.
I just have to reply to a message, if you'll excuse me for just a moment. Done.
Scroll through this chat here. Is there anything else?
And if there are no further questions, then we've ended almost on time. This has been 67 minutes, more or less. Thank you so much, Alex. This was so helpful, and you're clear, you're succinct, and your friendliness also is very much appreciated, especially from those of us who are afraid of orchestra librarians, sometimes with good reason. So thank you all so much also for attending this webinar. And Toronto, could you take us out? Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.